Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you find yourself. Welcome to today's webinar, A Lifelong Journey Towards Justice, Inspired by Violence. Thank you for joining us today, in spite of load shedding in South Africa, for those who have trouble with that. Let's just get comfortable. It's Leonie Forster speaking, by the way, so I'll be presenting today. Let's get comfortable with the tech first. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. So if you have questions for the Q&A session at the end, please log them there. Then we've stopped the chat because of the volumes and for time and structure reasons. But you're welcome to send in the chat function, you can still send anything you need to know to the organizers. And then the CPD link for those who are in the running for CPD points, you can get the CPD link at the end, also in the chat from the organizers. Right, so I'm Leonie Forster. I'm a research psychologist, and I'm currently based in Johannesburg. I do a bit of writing, a bit of strategy, a bit of research, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what I'm up to at the moment shortly. The first thing I want to do, just to make sure that everyone knows what's happening with the tech, there's a hand raise button. So can I ask perhaps that you tell me whether you believe in justice? Raise your hand if you believe in justice. I'll give you a few seconds for that before we continue. Right, so today's talk is very much about justice and getting to justice when you experience violence. In 2006, Tarana Burke, who's an advocate for women in New York, started the Me Too movement that some of you might be familiar with. She wanted to let women who had endured sexual violence know that they were not alone. In 2006 was also the year that I broke the silence about my abuse as a child, and it was the beginning of my journey of recovery. Fast forward to 2017 and the Me Too revival that most of you will be familiar with, which also manifested in South Africa, but not just in Me Too form, also in other forms, with some of the movements and the hashtags actually predating the Me Too revival. I'm thinking of the I Am Next campaign, for example. Towards the end of that year, I was anxious. I knew that breaking the silence was actually just a first step. On the other side of the outcry and the sympathy, the comfort and the reassurance, beyond the safety and the sanctuary of empathy and solidarity with the other victims of violence, surviving violence and breaking the silence was not enough for recovery. My personal recovery journey and search for restorative justice, which started more than a decade before, had actually taught me that. So not long after the Me Too revival, my journey of recovery gave birth to a journey of discovery. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean with journey of discovery in case you want to apply the process in your own life or in your own work in some way. Outside of academia, and sometimes also in academia, a journey of discovery often starts from personal experience. You get to know yourself and you learn from your own experiences. But you also get to know others, friends, family, colleagues, clients, and so on. And you also learn from their experiences. Then, if you want to make a lasting contribution to the body of knowledge, the knowledge gained from experience transitions into a more formal investigation in the form of scientific research. Maybe you start with secondary or desk research to discover and analyze the body of knowledge that already exists, or you use primary research to fill in the gaps where there's a lack of knowledge or where there is disagreement. So this journey of discovery, for most journeys of discovery, the process is iterative. So you move back and forth between experience and investigation, between the self and others, between new and existing information. And there's one last thing I have to mention about discovery, and that is that it's my belief that a journey of discovery should be shared, because it is in our sharing that we are challenged, but it's also in our sharing that we find meaning and that we learn. Today, I'm sharing with you the results of my journey of discovering the impact of violence at all these levels. From an in-depth analysis of my own experiences and that of others, as well as the most recent research about violence, I'll be sharing a typology of violence and the ways in which people live their lives after violent events and the impact that violence has on individual, family, communities, and global well-being. The ways in which people live their lives after, I will identify the one thing that most survivors of violence need. And using an example from the South African context, I'll argue that the needs of survivors are unmet to a very large extent. Lastly, I will share with you what I'm doing about those unmet needs. So what is violence? Here's how the World Health Organization defines it: the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. That's quite a mouthful. And by the way, I don't agree with the World Health Organization that violence is always intentional. I do think that sometimes violence is not intentional, but it is still violence nonetheless. Violence takes many forms, and a typology of violence is needed to provide structure for thinking about violence. It helps us to organize the information and the interventions in terms of violence. The typologies of violence basically distinguish firstly between the violence or who the violence is perpetrated against, and there are three categories against which violence can be perpetrated. First of all, oneself, and I'm going to use a very silly example, but a lot of people will probably feel that one. When you work yourself into a state of burnout, for example, that is violence against yourself. Violence against another person, that's as in an armed robbery, for example. And then the third category is violence against a group or community. And apartheid was a good example of that. Each of these can also be described in terms of the nature of the violent event or the perpetrator. So, for example, in terms of self-directed violence, There are categories for suicide and for self-harm, like cutting or pulling your hair out. And then in terms of the interpersonal category, there are two types there. It's a family or partner that is the perpetrator, or it is someone in the community. And if it's a family member or a partner, it can be a child, it can be a partner, it can be an elder. In the community side of things, if it's someone in the community, then it can be an acquaintance, like a microaggression at work, for example, or it can be a stranger, a complete stranger, and for example, a hate crime would be an example of that. In the third category, where we had violence against a group or community, which is called systemic violence, there are also a number of categories. So it can be social, like corruption, for example. It can be political violence, like apartheid, like genocide, or it can be economic violence, like poverty, as a form of economic violence. So first of all, we have who it is against, then we have who the perpetrator is. But finally, violence is also described in terms of the nature of the violence itself. And there we include physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, neglect as the main forms of violence, main nature of violence. So all of these things combine in different ways. And in South Africa, for example, all these forms of violence are quite prevalent and often in combination. So self-directed violence, for example, SADC, the anxiety, depression and anxiety group, estimates that there are at least 23 suicides per day in South Africa. And for every one suicide, there are at least 20 attempted suicides. So that is quite a bit of violence in that category. In terms of interpersonal violence, a third of children are sexually abused, and 40% of these children are actually sexually abused by other children. In terms of systemic violence, the United Nations reports that at the end of last year, 1 in 5, so 20% of South Africans were living in extreme poverty. And they define extreme poverty as less than 800 Rand per month. And the wealthiest 10% earn more than half the national income. So a significant part of the balance has been squandered through corruption. And all of those are systemic violence examples. I don't want to dwell too much on that because our focus is more on the impact today. So let's look at the impact of violence. First of all, how do we respond when we feel that we are in danger? A few years back, we were all thinking fight or flight, the first two categories. Fight being movement towards danger, to fight it, and flight being movement away from danger. But since then, researchers have added quite a bit to that in terms of the responses. The first one that was added was already, again, quite a few years ago, and that was the freeze response, and that's immobility or helplessness. So that is an additional way that people respond to threats. Then there's the please and appease response, where someone becomes completely compliant. And if you think of sexual assault and rape, those kinds of violent crimes, then please and appease is often the way that people respond for survival. Attach or cry for help is when someone responds in a very needy way. So they cry for help all the time. As a counselor, you might have clients who do that, or you might be someone, and it actually has the opposite response than people would want. So the more needy you are, the more people get pushed away because they react to the neediness in a negative way. And then the response of collapse or submit. where you don't push back, and that's where helplessness becomes hopelessness. And then connection and safety as a response is supposed to be when you have a calm response, or when you at least return to being calm after seeing a threat. These responses can all become habitual in the case of unhealed trauma, which is why I'm mentioning them. So keep that in mind as we look at the problem with violence. Isn't the problem with violence not that, as the saying goes, hurt people? And that is probably true, even when the only person that they are hurting is themselves. It is still someone hurting that is hurting someone else or someone. Trauma is a big part of violence. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of violence in the form of trauma. Firstly, at an ancestral level, violence can result in inherited trauma that affects the traditions and the liturgy and the beliefs and the culture and even the discourse and the legacy and so on. And those are internalized subconsciously or even physically. There's a growing body of epigenetic research that suggests that trauma can be passed from one generation to the next. And trauma can leave a chemical mark on genes. So some of the research says, is finding that altering the mechanism, that the violence that you experience leaves a chemical mark, and that alters the mechanism by which the gene is expressed. And it can then be passed down to future generations. So experience could alter biology and behavior of the children and grandchildren of victims of violence. We inherit the unhealed trauma of our ancestors. And we also inherit the patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving that they developed in order to manage the trauma or to survive. So that's epigenetics in a nutshell. I'm not going to go into, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into a lot more detail about that. But it is interesting that trauma can also be passed on, especially in the South African context where we've had a long history of violence. It is worth noting that. Then secondly, at a collective level, violence harms the social structures like family and community bonds. And it increases healthcare costs for everyone. And it uses resources that could be otherwise employed. And it impacts negatively on productivity. So it actually has quite a huge economic cost. And I'm not talking about the cost of violence at the scale of war even. The social burden and the economic impact of violence against children in South Africa, for example, has been estimated at nearly 5% of South Africa's gross domestic product. To give you an idea, that's more or less the size of the entire facilities management industry. So here's another example from the PsySSA Victims of Crime Survey of 2020. 117,000 households in South Africa experienced assault between 2015 and 2019. On average, there are about 3 people per household in South Africa. So that means that 351,000 people have to recover from the impact of just one form of violence. At an individual level, violence can have more than 150 effects that I've picked up in the research. And these effects can, in broad groups, can include everything from obsessive behavior to compulsions, post-traumatic stress disorder, anger, antisocial behavior, anxiety, stress, depression, dissociation, self-injury, body issues, gastrointestinal issues, somatic complaints, substance abuse, relationship issues, sexual difficulties, and addiction. And in addition, a host of the DSM disorders that can be classified as DSM disorders. So I want to use, and just for those who are getting a bit depressed, it gets better. So the idea is not to depress anyone. The idea is to inspire you. But let me use the example of childhood sexual abuse. 10% of children across the globe, so not just in South Africa, 10% of children across the globe, and about a third of children in South Africa, boys and girls, are sexually abused. The prevention of sexual abuse of children and the protection of children from sexual abuse are inadequate, and that is across the globe. Despite there's a huge body of knowledge about sexual abuse, but in spite of that body of knowledge, sexual abuse of a child can go unnoticed. And even when it is discovered or when it is disclosed, it's often not reported. When it is reported, the overall conviction rate, to use the South African example, is around 8% of reported crimes. That's crime in general. And restorative justice is actually non-existent. So even though there are attempts and there are policies in place, restorative justice does not happen. And I will talk a little bit about that in a moment. Recovery and treatment, in terms of the services and facilities, are under-resourced. They are often ineffective, in some instances non-existent. And Doctors Without Borders in a 2017 study found that the services and the facilities can actually be harmful in some instances because of all these factors. So there is no prevention to speak of. Violence happens, and the situation has been exacerbated by COVID restrictions. So there's little protection for survivors. Prosecution is virtually non-existent, and there's hardly any form of effective corrections. And those aspects of the justice process means that survivors don't just have needs once they experience violence. It starts with the very basic need to feel secure. And that's even before violence takes place. And security means that your needs are met. Your physical needs, your emotional needs, psychological needs, cognitive needs, etc., those needs are met. That is where it all starts. So even before someone experiences violence, they are often in our context already experiencing the violence of not feeling secure. In terms of the violence, that is a loss. You lose something when you experience violence. You assign emotions and mourn what has been lost, and you grieve. So you actually go through a grieving process when you experience violence. Then in terms of the protection and safety, you feel unsafe. And in terms of the child sexual abuse example I was using, and other victims of violence feel unsafe in their bodies and in their relationships. So safety, feeling safer is a need. Then the need to be recognized. So to have agency, to have courage, to have a voice, to be believed, to feel other people's compassion, and to feel that your dignity is being respected. And in the prosecution process in South Africa, that is often not the case and definitely not the experience for victims. Then to feel connected, connected is where a redress of the harm that had taken place needs to happen. And a lot of victims of violence redefine themselves and their relationships. So they have to reconnect and again form connections. And lastly, the need to integrate, to feel integrated, to be in control instead of needing to control or being controlling. And that entails reclaiming what you had lost because of the violence. And there are various types of justice, but that integration and where justice has to happen is where a lot of the need arises for victims of violence. I'm going to briefly touch on the types of justice to illustrate how that comes into play. But it really is a summary. So again, we don't have a week to talk about this. So I'm going to talk about each one briefly. Restorative justice is also sometimes called corrective justice, and that seeks to make whole those who have suffered unfairly. But with something like childhood sexual abuse, this is particularly difficult to achieve, as it usually requires the cooperation of the perpetrator. It typically involves having the perpetrator and the victim sitting together to resolve the conflict and the harm that was done. And the perpetrators seldom volunteer admissions of guilt, especially with something like childhood sexual abuse. And also the children are often very reluctant, understandably, obviously, to be in the same room as the perpetrator. So it makes restorative justice extremely difficult in the context. The second type of justice I wanted to talk about, and think of all these as in interaction and happening at the same time, surrounding a person who experiences violence. The second type of justice is systemic justice or social justice. And that basically means that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social opportunities, irrespective of race, gender, religion, and so on. So it links quite closely to human rights. Again, some of that seriously questionable whether that is in place in the South African context. Then distributive justice refers to the equitable allocation of assets in society, and we know that South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world. Retributive justice seeks to punish the wrongdoers objectively and proportionately. And even there, with an 8% conviction rate, even retributive justice fails. Then the second last one, procedural justice, refers to implementing legal decisions in accordance with fair and unbiased processes. And we do have that to some extent, especially with judicial independence, although that's questioned these days. Environmental justice is the fair treatment of all people with regard to environmental burdens and benefits. And again, we are very unequal in that regard. I'm sure there are more. So there are more forms of justice in the bigger sense. But I see these forms of justice as aspirational. So we certainly have not adequately achieved any of these in South Africa. But even if we were to achieve these, which I think is not going to happen anytime soon, but if we were to achieve these, the survivors of violence have to find their own internal justice, which is different from the external forms of justice. So for survivors, justice means reclaiming what they had lost. Nobody else can do that for them. They need to find a new way to be secure, to be safe, to be recognized, to be connected, to be integrated. And yeah, sure, prevention is better than cure, but it can never be a substitute for cure. And surviving is not a long-term goal. Surviving is actually not good enough. Dr. Kelly Wilson of One Life Education warns against what he refers to as recoveryism, which is the expectation that someone who has experienced violence can be restored to a feel-good cultural ideal, which he actually calls absurd. Recovery is much richer and far more complex than the notion of, and now everything is great again. So you wake up one morning and everything's fine. Recovery is a journey. Think of recovery and healing as influenced by many factors long before a violent event and without a finite endpoint. On a personal note, I'm not the only adult survivor who has been told to get over it, but you don't actually get over violence, and you shouldn't have to. The impact of violence remains inextricably part of your thinking, your believing, your feeling, your interacting, and your physical being, whether you are aware of it or not. Survivors of violence have a choice. They can either surrender to the unavoidable negative effects and become part of a circle of violence and become hurt people who hurt people, or they can use the negatives as building blocks to something positive. The first step is obviously to say the cycle of violence stops with me, allowing you to choose and build a new healing path. This is in many ways the more difficult option, but it is also far more rewarding. One of the key challenges in my own recovery journey, for example, was reclaiming my identity. And it was in this process it was in the process of doing this that I realized how my experiences, including the violent ones, inspired me to find my own secure, safe, and strong space, also in my relationship with others. I was inspired in so many ways that I could not help but be grateful for all of it, the good and the bad. One of the ways in which my own and others' experiences of violence and my desk research about violence has inspired me was to develop a recovery framework for adults who experienced childhood sexual abuse. And the launch is planned for before the end of the year. But there are 5 versions of the program. There's 5 seats healing free, 5 seats healing light, 5 seats healing interactive, 5 seats healing top up, and 5 seats healing time out. And the idea with that is that each version includes different types of healing processes using combinations of information and services. What often happens is victims of violence have to find their own way to find all the different things they need to get to their own internal process of justice. And it's very seldom that it's in one place. Now, I come from privilege. So I was able to access, for example, long-term psychological assistance and counseling more than once in my life. Many people don't have that. And in South Africa, that is almost a luxury. So the idea with the program is to combine different types of healing processes that the person can actually engage with themselves. For example, one of the types or one of the versions of the program includes a combination of information and services. One includes information and support network links. Others include self-help exercises or additional information or a discussion forum or assignments and more exercises, or access to external paid for support like counseling, like going to see a psychologist. So the idea is to make it easier for someone to combine all the things they need as and when they actually need it, instead of hoping that they will find what they need in whatever resource they have access to at a particular time. So just 5 seats refers to 5 types of integrated healing. And it focuses on the integration, but also the different parts. So I'm going to start and just go through each one of those briefly. Cognitive healing, referring to striving for optimal cognitive status. And that's things like making judgments, learning, problem solving, being open to new ideas, thinking critically, and being innovative and creative. So being able to find those things gives us security. It is a big part of finding security and finding balance. Secondly, the emotional side of things, so the need for emotional healing, is often people are struggling to see the beauty. They're struggling to feel safe. So being aware of and experiencing and accepting and producing or generating and expressing and managing your own feelings and emotions, and connecting with others and their feelings and emotions and moods and thoughts, and all of that in a positive way. Then in terms of the third need is around social healing. And that is finding a voice, being able to trust, but being recognized, sharing, developing, sustaining meaningful social relationships, being able to communicate and to connect with others, for the purpose of belonging, for the purpose of inclusion, for the purpose of support, for the purpose of stability. So all of those things are needs. And you can hear from this that if there isn't help available, someone struggles through this, or they don't struggle at all and they just don't deal with it and become part of that cycle. Then in terms of the physical healing, attachment is definitely an issue, health issues, and all of that is about being connected. So performing physical activities without undue bodily pain or discomfort in a safe and secure physical environment. Hygiene, making healthy choices, avoiding preventable conditions, all of those things are part of physical healing. And then spiritual healing, I think, is one of the most important ones, and that is the integration part. That is where wholeness comes from. And it has mostly to do with the need for purpose. So knowing your own true inner self and connecting with the universe to pursue, to experience, to integrate, to realize your values, your beliefs, your faith, your ethics, your virtue, excellence, meaning, whatever that is for you. So spiritual, I don't mean religious for that. It is much broader than that. So anything that you feel, any healing that relates to purpose and finding meaning in your life and what you do. And when you lose, I mentioned that identity is a big challenge. If you lose your identity, it is a little bit of a circular thing. You lose your identity, so you have no purpose, but you also have no purpose because you have no identity, or you are questioning your identity. There are a number of things in terms of the program that I want to mention, because I think that's questions that people come up with if you're also looking at developing something like this. Funding, for example, we're looking at different models. People who can afford paying a little bit extra to fund people who cannot afford. The various levels of program allows for free program components and also paid for components. But we also look at sponsorship. We look at external funding to help those who can't access funding to do it themselves. I wanted to mention also how it's possible for you to become part of the referral network, especially in terms, for those of you who are in helping professions or in counseling specifically, counseling skills. One of the ways that you can get involved is in the referral network. That's basically done on a 6-month basis, and we develop a professional website for you because we would like people who participate in the program, if they are referred to you, to get a professional interaction. Or if you already have a website, then 12 months of within the referral network is the equivalent of that. And why this referral network is a little bit different from many others in that 12 months that the contract is reviewed based on utilization and user ratings. So the people who do ask for help from you will get to give feedback about that, and that will determine whether you remain as part of the referral network. So that's one way, is the referral network. The second way is from next year, I'll be needing facilitators for the online discussion forum. So being able to be present in the discussion forum and facilitate that. So I just wanted to mention that briefly for those who are interested. So please do get in touch if that is something that is of interest to you. Then also, after my journey of discovery, to share all the personal experiences of myself and others and the secondary research that I had done, I was hoping to make the information as accessible as possible. So basically, I decided to write a novel, a storybook, instead of a textbook or a doctorate or a journal article, because as we all know, not many people read textbooks or theses or academic journals. A storybook, on the other hand, can inspire and encourage survivors so they can start to reclaim what they had lost because of their own experiences, because it can put them as the reader in the character's shoes. Also, with a storybook, it can reflect actual lived experiences and inner worlds, and it can give an in-depth perspective of real lives lived after violent events. So it can promote empathy and more effective support for survivors. But lastly, and in this case specifically, the book sales are also funding the development of the recovery framework in the program that I've just been talking about, to identify and to help survivors. So, yeah, it is a magical realism novel, and you might wonder why I chose that. The genre of literature this particular genre of literature, magical realism, is about the real world and the magical elements that form part of it. So by including magical elements as a normal part of everyday life, the line between reality and magic becomes blurred. And that is often the experience following extreme violence, that reality and what is so real becomes one thing. Most magical realism novels take place in a setting in the earthly world that is familiar to the readers, but the stories have magical or fantastical elements that don't occur in the actual real world, so almost a dreamlike content. But these are presented as normal in the story, because in that person's reality, that is normal. The magic is not explained, and that's done on purpose to normalize it as part of everyday life. In this particular genre, there is no narrative arc, so you won't have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that is very much the way that the recovery works. It stops, it starts, it goes in a different direction, and it carries on pretty much for most of your life. There's no plot advancement, no conflict can happen. Conflict can basically happen at any time. So that for me was why magical realism was ideal for the content that I was trying to, if you have to explain to people 150 different symptoms, the easiest way to do that is to actually write a story where someone has all of those effects and lives all of those effects. So magical realism writers implicitly also critique society. And for me, that is a very important part of sharing all this information. So by writing in this genre, I was able to comment on things like dogmatism and hypocrisy and the role these play in perpetuating violence. It also allowed for showing how privilege plays a role in how you recover from violence. So the ebook is on Amazon for Kindle, and it's on Smashwords for other e-formats. And the softcover book is available on the book's website. I think, yeah. So when I say that the journey to justice was inspired by violence, I do mean that it was inspired by violence. I know it sounds funny, but I don't think that we have enough resources to help everyone that needs help, given how vast the issues are around violence in South Africa. I want to talk a little bit about just recapping what we've done up to now, and that is in terms of the process that I followed. First of all, starting your recovery journey, if you need to, if there's something you need to recover from, or don't, it's up to you. It doesn't determine the rest of the process, although it impacts it. Then go on a journey of discovery to get to know yourself and to get to know others. And that journey of this discovery for me teaches empathy. And that is something that is lacking. And the moment that we talk about victims of violence, at least a third of people can empathize. But often people cannot empathize with that because it is such a personal experience for each individual. And the only way to actually learn what that impact is other than listening to a talk like this that lists all the different types of impacts and what can be done about it, is actually to know yourself, first of all, but also to know others, to speak to others, and to find out what their experiences are. It is, I have to say, in terms of my process, it's often in hindsight. So when I wrote the book, it wasn't so much about that part of the recovery. That part of the recovery process I had already done several years before. So for me, it was a way to communicate the information. And it wasn't a kind of in the moment cathartic process. So it was quite a reflective process. But at the same time, it helped me to identify where I am in the recovery process. And to be able to share that with others when I combined it with all the research, for me was, gave it meaning. So in that sense, it was very much inspirational to me. But you don't have to write a book. You still, if you don't write a book, you have to find a way to share the information with as many people as possible. And I think that is where research and our experiences are often not as meaningful as they could be, because they are not shared. And to find different ways of creatively sharing your discoveries with more than a journal, an academic journal, or with more than as part of a doctorate. Those who are doing studies will know that you get consumed by that. So it's the only thing that you think of doing. But once you've recovered from that, think of creative ways that you can share what you discover on your journey, but also on your, if you're studying, on your research journey. So the very science of what it is that we're doing, how can you creatively share that with others to inspire them and to help them to also learn without having to go through the 150 symptoms and all the articles written about that. So we have a tradition, I want to call it a tradition in Africa, where we go from, well, South Africa, definitely, and some of the work that I've done in the rest of Africa, that is also the case in a lot of the countries. In a kind of Western academic way, we have basic research that builds the body of knowledge, and that body of knowledge is then carried out to industry or where it is applied. So it becomes applied in other contexts, and that is then fed back into the process. But what happens in our type of context, with the volume of violence and the inadequacy of resources, the body of knowledge is often not built in academia. It is often built in practice. So we face a crisis, we work out how to solve it, we make a plan. And the information that we gather there, that we glean there, the experiences we glean there, we fail to share that with others for whatever reason. Sometimes it's confidence, or sometimes it's personal, but there are lots of reasons. We fail to share that, and that's never taken up in the body of knowledge. The COVID pandemic is a brilliant example of how all the innovation happened on the fly. There was very little preparation. So everything had to happen as it was happening, which is hectic. But it means that we innovate. And the psychology of it is only now starting to come through as written up bits of knowledge. Granted, very few people had time to deal with all of, to kind of still share it while you're in the midst of crises. But if we can find a way to creatively share our discoveries with each other, but also with members of the public, to make sure that the knowledge or the effort that we put into finding out things isn't wasted. So you can hear I'm going to get off my soapbox now, but that sharing of our discoveries for me is one of the most important parts of the reason why we go on journeys of discovery, whether they are personal journeys or scientific journeys. And then the last part that I think is important is to then do something good to make the world better. Find ways to address the gaps. Work with others to do it. We often try and do things on our own, but there's very little that we can achieve if we do it on our own. So find ways to address the gaps. And ways of doing more than just individual things, things that will have an impact locally and globally, if you can. I've spoken really fast, so I am almost out of breath. The needs for me all boil down to justice, and instead of finding external justice, finding internal justice. And that internal justice can be shared with others. In that way, the cycle of violence can hopefully be broken. I want to thank PsySSA for the opportunity to talk through this. I see there are a couple of questions, so we're going to work through those. And thank you very much for everyone who was here today and listening in. I'm going to go through the questions, and perhaps that will also raise additional questions, and please feel free to ask. The first question is from Anonymous, who says she's an educational psychologist at an all-girls school. So many of them aspire to study law with the idealistic perception that they can avenge victims of violence and injustice. Whilst I want to encourage them to pursue their dreams and passions, we know that our justice system is painstakingly flawed. How do I get them into a space where they start acknowledging the reality of our justice system, whilst at the same time not discouraging them from pursuing criminal law? For me, there's an interesting body of work around especially volunteer work or people pursuing things in reaction to. So, for example, someone who is sexually abused then becomes a crusader against sexual abuse. So someone who is a victim of violence and experiences injustice wants to avenge that. And this body of knowledge is that in terms of trauma and the experience of trauma, that is a violent response. So they are then part, you become part of, and I know this feeling so well. So I'm going to try and talk you through how I got through that and to the point where I didn't have that violent reaction. The theory is that as long as you respond in anger, or you try and address anger with anger, and you see that a lot in activism and that kind of thing, then you are adding to the anger rather than taking away from the anger. So the violence becomes more. And so for me, it was taking into account my own personal experiences and thinking about the research about that, that process of healing is when you find the justice within yourself, then you draw a boundary between what you can do and what is others' responsibility. And you don't want to do things to convince other people or to correct other people. You want to do things to help them get better. I know it sounds a little bit fla and fluffy, but so it's not about not fighting, but it is about being in yourself, recovering first, and finding security and safety and purpose in yourself. And if you can get to the point where you are grateful for your experiences, good or bad, that for me is the critical point where someone goes from hurt and hurting to healed and helping. To translate that back to a school level, I think requires an intervention that is not focused on, whether they're going to be frustrated in the justice system, but actually going back to what is driving the wanting to avenge victims of violence and injustice. So for me, the avenge part is the part that needs to change. And to rather say that you have to find a way to promote justice rather than promote personal justice, rather than to promote more violence. And that retribution, with the legal process that I explained, starting with prevention and ending with justice, people go through that entire process, even when it is a properly working process, and they still have not healed in themselves. So the healing in the self comes first, I think, in a lot of this. And like I say, it's not a process that you wake up in one morning and you suddenly recovered. It is something that you do every day. For example, I always use the example, some people might have heard me say that before, but I use the example of, I think back to some of my younger years, and I have to apologize to certain types of people who triggered me and who I reacted to, even in a work context. It was no fault of their own, but I reacted in that way because of parts of me that had not healed of the violence. So I think, for me, to answer your question, in summary, is that the focus should not be on the idealism, but on the avenge, and to make sure that they don't feel a need to avenge, but to actually be idealistic and realistic about what it is that they can do, what they can do and what they can't do. That was a very long answer. Sorry for that. Sorry, just looking at the questions and answers. Someone asked if they can receive the recording. Yes, as far as I know, the recording will be made available. I'm sure that will be shared with you after the session, sometime tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. Right, another question from an anonymous. From another anonymous, probably. what would you say are the largest current gaps in research regarding trauma in the South African context? I would say the biggest gaps would be probably around collective trauma, and perhaps more than the trauma, research about the healing of trauma. There's very little at a collective level in terms of trauma healing. There is very little, there's a lot about how to, the kind of early stages, you know, when someone has just experienced violence, there's crisis intervention, there's immediate support, possibly if you're in that a resourced position. So there is a lot of that, and there's a lot of research about that. There's very little, so there's a lot of research about what do people feel, what do they experience, and a little bit of how can we help them at that point. But what happens 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later? What happens when at a collective level, all the individuals that experience violence don't break the cycle of violence and continue to live violently, either to themselves or to others? So I think that kind of how the individual trauma adds up to a collective trauma in South Africa and in the South African context. I think that is a huge gap in terms of the research. And then also the more long-term effects of trauma, and not focusing. So there's a lot on the immediate trauma, but there's very little in that's being done that's particular to the South African context in terms of long-term trauma effects in especially in South Africa at an individual level even. Okay. Thank you, Anne, for the feedback. Right. Someone is volunteering at Mobich, which is an online text-based counseling platform that is totally anonymous, where anything can be shared. In the process of healing from trauma and sexual abuse, having a place to be open and share is greatly beneficial. What advice would I give to the counselor on the other side of the conversation related to activities that can aid the exploration of the trauma? I don't know if I'm quite getting that. Activities that can aid the exploration of the trauma. Okay. I think one of the biggest issues, especially immediately following trauma, is around safety and security. So I'm not talking safety as in someone's gonna jump out at me now any moment, although that is also a factor. When you are in conversation, like a counselor is in conversation with someone who is trying to be open and share about their trauma, and even if it is sexual abuse, one of the things that they're finding quite helpful, that is, it's not new, but the application is a little bit new, is someone goes into that fight or flight or freeze response, and they might get stuck there. And needing to talk about trauma actually puts them back in that, especially if it's a younger person or someone who's not particularly self-analytical. It can put them back into that trauma and traumatic experience. So for a counselor who's listening to this person, one of the biggest things is go slowly, because if the person is not ready to go there, it will make it worse and it will re-traumatize. So to explore that trauma, you can explore the impact of it without, especially in the beginning, exploring the content of it. And leading the person in terms of or asking them what would make them feel safe, what they need to feel secure, what they need to be recognized. So really taking cue, especially in that kind of context, when it's a text-based counseling platform, we can't read non-verbal cues, and people can put down anything. I mean, apart from the fact that the counselor would also need assistance and support because of secondary trauma. But the idea of, instead of asking someone to share exactly what happened to them, to share how it made them feel. So to share how it impacted them is a good place to start, rather than saying, tell me exactly what happened to you. If someone does share exactly what happened to them, to try and, one of the tricks I wanted to mention earlier is they're finding that to get someone out of that, if they are stuck in that traumatic experience, just sometimes getting them to move. So saying, stand up and walk around the desk, or so actually getting them to physically move can move their mind space out of that kind of frozen in the trauma feeling. Yeah, there are quite a few techniques like that. So but perhaps look at things like almost like the do's and don'ts. But the don'ts, I think, is definitely to not push the person beyond what it is that they are comfortable to discuss. I hope that answered the question. It must have been hard to, okay, sorry, next question from Marius, thank you. It must have been hard to survive on your own when everything else turns against you. I think that's it's part of the justice that one seeks. So I mean, the most depressing saying in the world is that life isn't fair, but it's also one of the most true sayings in the world. So life isn't fair. And the only fairness that you can have is that you create. And if you put fairness into the world, you can create fairness. So and perhaps that speaks again to the very first question. Instead of focusing on avenging, focusing on creating fairness. So creating good rather than fighting bad, for me, is always kind of the preferred way of doing things. Then from Genevieve, okay, thank you for this enlightening webinar. I'm a student registered counselor and often see male survivors of abuse. If we look at the Me Too movement, the primary focus is on women, which is because we are an oppressed population and desperately need the focus. But with the focus on women, how does one support male survivors of abuse and address their trauma, in particular in a patriarchal society where toxic masculinity is still pervasive? I mean, it is a very good question, and I think that some of especially some of the international interest that I've had in the process and the program and the book and so on has been from the perspective of someone who is abused, who is male. And in South Africa, for example, men are far more likely to commit suicide, which is one of the effects or one of the impacts of abuse, than women. And it is primarily because they do not they're not encouraged, as you say, they're not encouraged to deal with this or to share or to even acknowledge that it happened. So it is about all those needs that I've identified are still needs. So the need for security, the need for safety, the need for recognition, all of those things are still there, but you have to approach it in a different way. I think perhaps because of the patriarchal nature of the society, you cannot approach it in the same way as women. And I don't want to talk women and men. I actually want to talk female and male in terms of energy and any of the other ways that people that people live their gender. Um, so yeah, so I started with a focus on women because of my own experiences. So my research also focused a lot on the female survivor side of things. I do think, I mean, that is actually one of the areas where there isn't enough research about that. I think primarily also because research, people have to want to participate in research, and we want them to participate in research. But those things are very difficult to deal with. So you can, especially in the South African context, if you don't have access to resources, and then you add to that society and the way that the kind of men don't cry kind of approach, then it makes it very difficult for anyone to find help. And it makes it even more difficult. So you can go through your entire life without ever receiving help and without ever healing. So for me, I would say in terms of supporting male survivors or any other survivors of abuse and addressing the trauma, focus on their needs rather than focusing on the things they have no control over, and helping them to find a way to feel secure, to feel safe in a way that makes sense in their context. That is why I mentioned all the different types of violence and the way that that people deal with violence is different because of all those complex ways of combinations of we all have in South Africa. There's always a systemic violence that plays a role, whether you are in a dogmatic, extreme dogmatic upbringing as a form of violence, discriminated against for whatever reason. All of those things compound this, so it's never just the one. And for me, the importance of the journey is to actually find what justice means to you. So what security means to you, what safety means to you in your context, so that you can pursue that. So for me, that's a brilliant starting point, whether it's male, female, or any other type of approach, any other gender, man, woman, doesn't matter. For me, it is about what makes you feel safe, what makes you so the starting with this is the person will need to feel safe, the person will need to feel secure, the person will need to feel whole. What does that mean to them? And if you can get to what that means to them, then they can work with you and work on a plan to get to what that means to them and to try and achieve that within their very realistic context of what they can and cannot do. Just want to go. I hope that answers that. Let's just go down here. Okay. What is known about the relation between the process of forgiveness, healing, and justice? The justice system makes it difficult. It is a lengthy process to pursue and to support someone on their journey in the legal system. Yes, so that is, I mean, that's one of the key points for me today that I wanted to convey, is that if we are dependent on the external, if a victim of violence is dependent on the external system of justice, justice will never happen. It is hardly ever that justice happens in that system, the way that it stands. And I understand from the research, it's not just in South Africa. But even if it was the perfect justice system, it might still not help the person to feel safe, to feel secure, to be whole, even if that system is run perfectly and works perfectly. For me, the process of forgiveness and healing and justice, justice in the way that you define it for yourself, is far more important than the way that justice is defined externally. So for me, it starts with being able to define what justice means to you, and to be able to do that within your context in an achievable definition, if I can put it. That achievable sounds terrible, but so that's for me the first part. How that links to forgiveness, I think if the justice happens internally, then forgiveness becomes a lot easier. I mentioned being grateful. For me, gratitude was, even those bad experiences brought me to where I am today. And it inspired me to do all these great things. And it wouldn't have done that. I probably would have, well, I definitely would have been a completely different person had this not happened to me. But that is because I chose to heal. So I think that choice of healing, combined with finding what justice looks like for you, will probably get you to forgiveness. You know, for many years, there was no forgiveness there. It was never kind of, I will not forgive what was the people for what they had done to me. But in the end, that forgiveness came with, I don't have to take responsibility for what they did. It is not my fault. It has made me the person that I am today. I've identified the things I need to work on. I can do that. So I've mustered the resources to do that. And so I will heal. And in that sense, for me, that hurt people. For me, that is no excuse. But for me, it is, what kind of hurt must you be in to do something that awful to someone else? So for me, that played a role as well, to say, whatever that reason is, whether it's a collective or an ancestral trauma or anything that has brought the person to making that decision. So when you get to the point where you don't judge people for their decisions, but you also don't take responsibility for their decisions, and you draw a boundary between what you have control over and what you can decide, and what they have control over and what they can decide. So without external justice, you can still find justice and you can find forgiveness if you can sort out your own healing. And that's what you have control over. You don't have control over whether the justice system works or whether this person will show remorse or not. You have to find peace without those things, because that will not always be there. Okay, then what techniques or activities can be given to client to help them create a new safe space? Nicolette, for me, one of the first things is to define. They have to be able to define that safe space for them. And there are various, I mean, depending on your approach or your modality, there will be different ways of doing that. But it is a slow process. So again, go slowly is the first thing. But it also includes things like, even though the impulse is there to rescue the person, to not do that. At some point, I mean, for me, the crux is the person has to find their agency again. They have to find a way of being in control again. And that's so justice for me is safety and strength. And to help them to create that safe space is to first of all say what the impact was rather than what the event was, because the event almost becomes irrelevant. It had a certain impact on the person. And for them to understand what that impact is how they can start working on that. Sorry, there's like a whole body of work on the techniques and the activities and so on. I've mentioned one of them, getting the person to move. But if they can define what unsafe is to them, and using that to define what safe is to them, then they can create that safe space if they can find a definition for it. But that definition has to come from they have to be able to define it. Sorry, it looks like my connection is doing a bit of a wobbly. Okay. We've had some to add to my comments, I'm going to read what Kantha's saying. To add to your comments asked by the text-based counsellor, mindfulness-based interventions are evidence-based interventions for processing trauma. So that's the here and now kind of intervention I'm adding in. Sorry, Kantha. From a neuroscience perspective, moving the neural pathways from fight or flight to more executive processing, which creates safety when client engaging in trauma counseling. So again, that's the idea. That's why the move thing works in a lot of cases, because it gives the person the ability to do something. So they're no longer in fight or flight or freeze or collapse or whatever their response was. So from neuroscience perspective, absolutely, to move to more executive processing is the goal with that. It has to happen slowly so that the person doesn't see that as a threat. So no pushing, because pushing will make the person feel threatened. Okay, yeah. So yes, thank you, Kanta. That's helpful. Any other questions at this point? Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I think that's it. Okay, that's it from the Q&A. Please get in touch if you need to or want to. It's been a pleasure being with you all today, and all the best with the great work that everyone's doing. I can see from the questions even that everyone is busy with good work. So thank you very much for that. And to PsySSA again for the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you very much for that. From my side, that's it. Thank you.